Hey folks, my name is TJ Kastning and you're joining us for the Ambassador Group podcast. We're here exploring with other professionals how to build better aligned teams with more human sensitivity. So I'm excited to introduce Kevin Cleveland. He's joining us from O'Hagan Meyer. Kevin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks, TJ. Happy to. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Cleveland. I am an attorney at O'Hagan Meyer. In a prior life, I also used to do a lot of HR, and during my years, I've also done a whole lot of recruiting. So I'm excited to be here and talk a little bit about recruiting, interviewing, and things that we can do a little bit better from a legal perspective. Real quickly, if you don't mind, I'll also just say O'Hagan Meyer is a large litigation-based firm that's throughout the United States. We have a lot of excellent litigators. We also do a lot of advice and counseling for what I do. My views today are not meant to be legal advice, but I am happy to share my own personal views today, even though they might not necessarily be those of my firm. And I'm just excited to be here. Thanks, TJ.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm super excited to talk with Kevin because Kevin is an attorney that understands the details of employment law, but also understands that we've got to get out and take risk and do work and make things happen. And so we've had some really refreshing conversations about real risk management, functional, productive, profitable risk management that's legal, that's moral, that treats people well. And it's been incredibly refreshing to get to know you, Kevin, and what you bring to the market. So thanks for jumping in here with us. My first question for you is as an attorney, where do you see people making the most consistent mistakes? Like if we knew what you knew, what kind of things would we be more careful about?
That's a really interesting and fun question. I think the thing that people don't think to worry about, because like we all know, like don't discriminate against people, don't sexually harass people in the workplace, like all of those things I think we know. Weirdly enough, I think the thing that most often gets missed in the workplace is weirdly a lesson that you probably got taught when you were a little kid, which is the golden rule. Treat others as you want to be treated. Because the problem is so often in the workplace, the pressures of work that get to us, the, constant deadlines, they get to us, they wear on us, they make it difficult to not just worry about those things and remember that the people that we're dealing with are also people that are dealing with their own lives and dealing with their own problems. And I think if people remembered that more, they would probably be able to avoid a lot of lawsuits, a lot of problems, things like that I do end up seeing. Because at the core of most of the lawsuits that I ever deal with is there was an employee who didn't feel that they were treated fairly or properly. And that normally started with someone just not really thinking about, hey, am I treating others how I would want to be treated? And I think if we kind of remember everybody's human, everybody makes mistakes. The key is that we all work together and recognize those things to try and do better. I think the workplace generally would be a lot better and avoid a whole lot of lawsuits.
I love this perspective because it's so practical. Every single one of us can take this to work and apply it immediately. But why is it so hard for us to keep this in mind when, like you said, we learn this as kids, but then we go to work and why do we stop worrying about treating people well?
It's from what I can tell, at least, I think it's a whole lot of different factors. I think you've got issues with people going, hey, I don't have the time to be nice. I don't have the time to explain it. I've just got to get this thing done. So some of it's, I think, time pressure. I think some of it's, the sort of, Wall Street, time is money mentality. So I think there's a lot of that going on. And then I also, feel that some of it as well is a notion born out of, 80s movies or something where like, to be the boss is to show that you are, a stern person to be taken seriously. Increasingly, I think we've figured out that that's not really the right way to be a proper supervisor to people, and that instead of actually being a human being and dealing with your employees is a much better strategy. But I still think there's sort of that notion out there that's slowly dying off, but I think it's still there. And so I think a lot of people are dealing with the sort of bad notion of what a good boss is.
I'm curious, Kevin, you've seen a lot of different lawsuits. Obviously, there's a big spectrum. There's always a bell curve. I'm curious, when you think about the middle of the bell curve and maybe the greatest population of those lawsuits and the leadership that ends up involved in them, do you notice any commonalities there, beyond perhaps a general misstep in how they treated someone?
I think generally when I look at the different kinds of lawsuits that I see, normally it's one of two things. It's either just a fundamental lack of understanding of various laws. So an employer just doesn't understand how meal and rest times are supposed to work in California, and they implemented a policy wrong, and then that ran for years. And now every single employee they have was not properly taking meals or rest periods over 3 years. It's that kind of thing. But more often, it's kind of what we were already talking about, which is in a lot of the wrongful termination cases that I see, discrimination, harassment cases, it's normally just that there are communication issues between the supervisor and their employee. And then instead of trying to work through those communication issues by being open and honest about the fact of, hey, we seem to be having issues communicating. What can we do to improve this? What's happening in the background? Why can't we seem to work together? Instead of addressing that, they either one, just view it as a problem with the employee, or two, they never try and fix it. And so though they are disciplining that employee and telling them that they're not doing things the right way, they're never really getting to the question of why aren't they doing things the right way? Why is it that we don't seem to be able to talk to one another and get on the same page? And I think that's the tricky part for folks, because that does take some time. It does take some effort and does pull you away from the other things. But what I always tell my clients is, look, this is worth doing, because if you do it right, then you're going to get to find out, is this an employee who can do the job on the level I need them to do it at, instead of having to have some suboptimal employee for the rest of all time, because you guys never get on the same page.
Sounds like a lot of people skills required, maybe some self-awareness, personal work.
Well, and I think that's right. Exactly. Is, if you said, well, what is possibly the character flaw, to the extent it's a character flaw that you see, that often drives the creation of a lot of these cases, I think it's sometimes a lack of self-awareness regarding, what are the effects of my actions that I take? And that's on both sides, because a lot of times it's also the employee who has no self-awareness of, gee, I'm in a workplace. Maybe I'm not allowed to just yell at people however I want, whenever I want. Maybe when I don't turn in my, documentation on time, it prevents payroll from being able to go out in a timely fashion. Or, if I don't return these things on time, then it backs up the whole process for everybody else. And so I think that's a lot of it, is just a lack of awareness on both sides.
You saying this makes me think about that book, Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. And he refers to the malpractice lawsuits. They did a study, and interestingly, it wasn't the doctors with the greatest incident of malpractice. It was the doctors that people didn't like. Do you feel like this is kind of a corollary in employment law?
No, I think that's absolutely true. Like I have clients who make mistakes because they're human, and that's gonna happen, especially in California where I practice law, because in California there's so many laws. I unfortunately joke with my clients, my job is to make sure I know all the employment laws and to make sure that you keep up with them. Here's the bad news. That's my full-time job, and it's difficult for me to keep up with all of the laws involving employment. I don't know how a normal HR person is supposed to do HR while keeping up with all of the laws that exist in California. So that being the case, mistakes are going to get made. And so I think if you're the kind of person who's willing to own them when they happen and fix them, people see that, one, as good, you are acting like a human being. Two, we know that we can trust that if you make mistakes, you're going to fix them. So that means now we can bring you mistakes or concerns that we have or whatever, and we know that you're going to look at them and you're going to address them. And sometimes maybe we'll get an answer or a thing will happen that we want. Sometimes maybe you're going to say, no, we can't do that, but you'll probably give me a reason. And even though I might not agree with it, I'll at least accept it, because I at least know that you considered what I was saying and you thought about it. And I think those are the sorts of things that go a really long way with a lot of employees.
Where do you feel like HR plays into some of this, in like good HR and doing risk mitigation and setting policy and staying on top of the laws and the incoming laws? versus situations where you maybe see HR not able to really be the buffer or risk mitigator that they would like to be.
I think generally when you see HR done well, it kind of does come from this, human perspective where they try and, understand what are the human factors that are getting in the way of a person being able to do their job well. Because normally if you've got an HR incident, it's some sort of somebody saying somebody's not doing their job or violating policy. And most of the time, it's not because you're going to run into an employee who's just like, I think this policy is stupid, and so I refuse to do it. It might be, hey, I just didn't know that was a policy. Sorry, I'll fix it. But a lot of times there's something else that's happening that's getting in the way. An attendance problem is normally not just, hey, I'm sorry, I'm bad at waking up on time to get to my job. Sometimes it's that, but normally it's because something else happened in the background. They're not going to sleep on time because they have a narcolepsy problem. They have narcolepsy. They have, sleep disorder. They have, they're depressed right now, so they're staying up all night drinking or something unfortunate. You never know what it is. And so I think good HR gets to find out what some of those things are without necessarily trying to find out protected statuses and a bunch of other information that maybe you don't need. And so I think in terms of also making sure that you stay up on the laws, it's also just a question of how proactive are you? And to be honest, how much time do you have to be proactive? Because that's the other thing too, is a lot of HR departments are just completely overwhelmed. Or even worse, a lot of my clients don't even have HR departments or an HR person because they're small enough that is just not something that they can afford yet. And so now you've got somebody who is a business owner trying to get their business off the ground, trying to make sure that it's running, trying to, keep up with clients, get more clients, all that sort of thing, while also trying to figure out what the legal landscape is. So I always tell people that is a job, especially in states like California, New York, places like that you just can't do on your own. And so for those folks, my advice would be find someone, whether it's an HR group or an attorney or someone who can provide you with updates, keep you up to date on like the major things that are going on. And every so often just, pay them for, 2-3 hours to just kind of do a quick welfare check of how you're doing on HR issues. So they just go, hey, what are you currently paying your lowest paid employee? What are you currently paying your lowest salaried employee? All of those things, and go, okay, those all meet the levels that they should be at. How are you handling this? How often are you paying people, et cetera? And they can just walk through a lot of the basic things that sometimes people miss because they haven't checked a legal update.
How do you feel like companies can stay up to date on these laws every year without subjecting themselves or people who don't want to be there to mind-numbingly boring, legal dissertations? Is there an engaging way to get into this that doesn't include struggling?
Well, my hope is that at least what I do when I do presentations for folks at the end of the year is not a mind-numbing dissertation. I tried to not have it be, but I recognize it's also not everybody's cup of tea. I think the best resources you can find are things like at the end of every year, I do a legal update that kind of covers, hey, in the state of California where I live and practice, here are the things that happened this last year that matter for employers. And kind of here's the impact. A good one was 2 years ago. It kind of dovetails into what we're talking about. California basically started cracking down a lot on anything being in applications or in interviews where it could potentially lead to discovering a person's age. Up till that point, California, the rule had basically just been like, don't ask a birth date, don't ask an age, you're good. Then you can't engage in age discrimination. But then California kind of looked at it and went, of course, if you find out what year somebody graduated high school or college, you can kind of quickly do math and figure out how old they are. And so they started cracking down on additional things where like you might be able to find out those sorts of things. So largely we sort of just stripped dates out of a lot of our applications or a lot of the sections of applications and things like that so that it doesn't accidentally tip us off on those sorts of things. So those are the sorts of things that I try and discuss so they give people practical advice on things that they need to change or do differently. Outside of year-end presentations, I also think that there are some very good organizations out there. Stand Up for Cal Chamber in California, for example, who does a very good job of pushing out alerts and updates to folks. They don't normally provide them with legal advice directly, but they at least will flag the issues for them to make sure that they can go and update the things they need to. So I think there's some good organizations out there, and there's some very good attorneys also doing advice and counseling.
Great. We'll put some of those links in the description. It's awesome. Can we jump to interviews?
Absolutely.
Kevin, I'm curious what you would guesstimate is the proportion of lawsuits that originate from actual employment or pre-employment issues, interviewing, discrimination. Do you have any sort of a sense or feel for that?
I don't think you could put a percentage on it. I mean, I will say that it is a very low percentage all in all, because realistically, if people have a bad interview or just feel like someone didn't give them a fair shake, they don't have a relationship formed with that person yet and weren't subjected to it for more than, a couple hours at most. And so most of the time, those things don't lead to litigation unless there's either something really atrocious that happens in the process, or number two, if it's something where someone is upset about a thing and then they go talk to an attorney and an attorney goes, this seems like it's something that might be a systematic, like, oh, they did a drug test on you without telling you. Well, that's not right. I bet they've done that to all of their applicants, things like that, where it's kind of more of a class action situation. So the good news is when we're talking about making sure you're doing things right in interviews and recruiting generally, I don't think it's quite the same minefield that actual employment is when you have the employees themselves. There's still important things that you need to watch out for. There's still things that you need to make sure you're doing right. But honestly, I think those things are important because they make sure you get good employees. So then for the long haul, where you do have to worry about long-term relationships and people feeling like they were hurt or done wrong or things like that, that are far more impactful and far more often lead to litigation, you're better equipped with that because you've got the right people in the door in the first place.
I really want to know what those things are. What are your interviewing best practice tips?
Okay, I would say my best practice tips are: one, don't worry as much about experience. Almost everyone, I've done interviews in my life, both as an interviewer and an interviewee. And the amount of times that I have been interviewed and people wanted to just talk to me about my experience and my resume is shocking, because you have my resume in front of you. You know what my experience is because you can read. There are specific instances where you're going, hey, Kevin, have you ever done this thing? I didn't see that on your resume, but I know it's a thing that a lot of lawyers do, and we do it a lot, and it'd be good to know about. Okay, I get that. That makes sense. But by and large, when I interview folks, the thing I worry about the most is fit. I figure, and maybe this is just because I'm full of myself or something, but I figure I can teach people how to be an attorney. I can teach people how to do employment law. I can teach people what employment law is. What I can't teach people is to have ambition, have drive, have a good work ethic, to want to learn things, to want to be better. And so that's what I spend most of my time in an interview doing, is just trying to talk to people and be like, hey, are you the kind of person that when I show up in the office, I'm going to be excited to see, that excites me to work with them, that makes me want to, be a better attorney and help make you as my employee a better attorney. And it's difficult to say exactly how you find that in an interview, but I think we've all been in those interviews on one side or the other, and that's what you're looking for. The experience part will come. And so you're much better off finding somebody that's going to be the right cultural fit, so to say, for your company than you are trying to find experience. And I think that's where most people make those.
Do you think there'll ever be protections for employers from employees who've, to put it dramatically, perjured themselves on their resumes? Because I find, as somebody who looks at a lot of resumes and has seen candidates then get into the role and perform, sometimes the due diligence you have to do on that resume is, there's a joke. People are perfect 2 times in their life, once when they're born and once when they write a resume. So, do you think that will ever be looked at from a legal standpoint?
I wish I could say yes to that. My hunch is probably not. currently right now, I mean, if somebody really did um, engage in straight up fraud on their resume, there are laws already in place where theoretically you could try and sue them. Are those lawsuits ever probably worth doing or engaging in? No, I don't think so personally, because it's going to cost you probably more in legal fees than you'd ever get from it. And again, that kind of gets me back to the things that you can lie about on a resume are your experience. They are, how many years have you done this thing? What were the things you were doing at that company? And so in many respects, if what I'm doing instead is hiring for the person and the fit and I feel like you'd be good at this job, as opposed to, do I think you can have already done this job? I think that also kind of avoids some of those pitfalls, because if somebody has maybe embellished on their resume, but I wasn't banking on them being able to make or write, 3 motions for summary judgment in a single month, or be able to, go to court and be a first chair trial attorney, because I know by looking at court records and stuff that they haven't been a first chair trial attorney that much. I think that fixes a lot of those issues. Now, if there are key things that you need to know that person can do, because you are literally hiring somebody to, be a first chair trial attorney, then, spend the time and the due diligence to go do a little bit of background investigation to find out if that is true. But I think if it's not something that's absolutely critical to the job, again, you can avoid a lot of the pitfalls by just hiring for fit.
Yeah, I agree. Fit's really important. Where I notice digging into experience is really important is, and this is kind of a spectrum, it's in proportion to risk. So like, for instance, I'm in construction. And so if we've got a project that, we're going to jack a house up, we're going to build another story underneath it, huge shoring, if you've got an inexperienced superintendent running that project, there's massive liability. And in every way possible, you have to have somebody who absolutely knows what they're doing in that case. And you certainly wouldn't just be hiring for a good personality and a culture fit in that situation alone.
Well, that's certainly the case. I mean, there's certainly jobs, where like you do need to make sure that people have certain skills and requirements. The nice thing with a lot of that is, in a lot of those jobs, there's a certain level where you go, okay, like you had to be licensed to be able to do this thing. So do you have that license? Do you have that, certification or whatever? So I think that gets us part of the way there. And then outside of that, the nice thing, at least in construction and whatnot, is a lot of times you can basically find out, like, what have you actually worked on? Let me go look at this building and see how it was, like, oh, actually that project turned out really well. And you were with this group. But yes, I can tell from these documents that are with the county that, this company is the one who did that work and you were there at the time. So, okay. So I think there are some ways to kind of double check on that stuff. Unfortunately, I think that's much more an issue for you, especially in like the recruiting side of things, because you need to be able to vet your candidates and make sure that they are, who they are, because I know that you care a lot about the reputation of your company and making sure that you protect that, which I think is very awesome for someone in the recruiting field. But by the same token, I think you've got to make sure for the average folks, it is an issue, but maybe not the biggest issue.
Yeah, agreed. And hiring the person with all the experience, but who's not the right person, has its own set of consequences, like maybe creating different kinds of lawsuits.
Yeah. Well, and I will say on that one, because that's one where I've seen things often go wrong, is you hire somebody purely because of their resume and their experience. And to be honest, those people are normally very high achievers that are very good at the thing they're good at. Here's the problem. They're a complete and total jerk and no one can work with them. You're going to have to let them go at some point. Let me give you an idea of the thing that I've talked about already and you and I have discussed being important: humility. The person who's really amazing at the specific thing that they do normally does not have a lot of humility. So if all of a sudden you fire them, very often that seems to lead to lawsuits in my personal experience, when you have very high achievers or something get fired, because they have overachieved their entire lives. They have gone through their entire life thinking that they walk on water, because no one has dared ever tell them that they're wrong, because they're the best at this one thing, whatever. And so when all of a sudden you fire them, even if it's for their people skills, those folks often cannot take the fact that someone has fired them and told them that they were bad at something or they were not capable of doing something. And so then the blame has to go somewhere. And if they're not willing to accept any of that blame themselves, the blame has to be on you. It's something wrong with you. And you must be mistreating me because of some sort of reason. And so that's normally where I see a lot of lawsuits from executives when executives get fired or that.
What advice would you have for a leader who's facing a situation like that? Maybe they're trying to unwind a hiring mistake and they're realizing they need to handle it with sensitivity. How have you seen those situations successfully de-escalated without getting litigation involved?
I think the key is when you start suspecting that there might be an issue, whether it's a personality issue, if it's a clash with, kind of the values of the company versus the individual, whatever it might be, make sure that you start having some conversations about what the problem is and then start documenting them early. What I so often see is people not wanting to step on the toes of executives, high-level managers, supervisors, whoever it might be. And so they let the bad behavior go until it reaches a boiling point, at which, point I've literally had, a manager get in a fist fight with an employee. And it's happened multiple times in my career where I'm looking at going, how did it get to this point, guys? And the answer is there'd been issues all along, but no one was willing to do anything because the person was a high performer and they didn't want to say or do anything. And so we just had to reach this boiling point eventually. But you didn't have to. You could have early on brought up the issues. And again, you don't need to, do a written reprimand of the person or whatever, but do some documentation showing, hey, I sat down with Bob and we talked about the fact that, Bob has had some rough conversations with some employees lately. And, here are the things that we value. What can we do to help you, be ready for these conversations? I've had some companies even, bring in outside communications experts to try and train a manager or things like that. Now, I don't think that's always what's called for, but, I would expand the tool set beyond just an idea of like, I must discipline people. That's the only way I can make them better. And instead have conversations with folks about, hey, I want you to be successful here. But right now, the following things seem to be holding you back. What can I do to help you remove those barriers so that you can be successful? Because I can appreciate that it's got to also be incredibly frustrating for you as a manager to feel like you are not getting through to these employees. And that can't be something that you want to continue living with. So how is it that we can help prevent this from continuing to be a...
Yeah, interesting. Ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Always.
I'm curious, and I realize neither of us are trained psychologists. I consider myself almost like an informal anthropologist in the recruiting space. But I'm curious if you notice informally some coincidence of some variation of narcissism in these kind of conflicts, and if that's something that leaders should consider as they're going through an interview process or working things out, as maybe familiarizing themselves with how this can show up.
I would agree that it's probably a thing to take a look at. I think the main reason you should take a look at it is because it kind of gets back to what we were talking about before, where I think the people that are more likely to sue are the ones who are not going to accept personal responsibility for things. And, again, not a psychologist, but I think that a lot of folks who have narcissism are far less likely to be able to accept blame for things and or, really reflect on their role and the situation and how they may have contributed to it so that they can learn for the future and not have that happen again. And so I think it's worth learning from that perspective.
Can we jump over to interviewing?
Sure.
So I'm curious about interviewing process. I observe, frankly, a lot of chaos in interviews. I see a lot of hiring authorities wandering through interviews, not really having a plan, a lot of times relying on their gut, their intuition, coming up with questions on the fly. And not to scare anybody, but I believe that hiring is the most important thing a leader does, building the team, that builds the company is fundamental in a leader who has true strategic vision. And so when you see conflicts or things having gone south, I'm curious how you would connect really good interviewing, precise, strategic, intentional, planned, versus hiring authorities who are a bit unaimed in their hiring strategy.
Yeah. And I think some of that dovetails well onto that concept of, fit that I was talking about before, because I think where I often see things go wrong, or, even if you, let's say, just always hired the best available person, right, from every set of interviews, that's terrific. But if you're really trying to build a team, you need to build a team where all of the members complement each other. For example, I do a lot of advice and counseling. My legal partner in Fresno, he does a lot of litigation. That's great. He likes litigation. I like advice and counseling. Those are the two things in employment law you kind of need, right? And so the fact that I like one more and he likes the other one more lets us really kind of balance each other out well. What they could have done when they hired me instead was just get another really good litigator. That would have been good, but it's probably not as good as if you got both parts of it so that you can kind of synergize and do better. And so I think that's where I see a lot of people make mistakes, is they're not worried about how does the team fit together to make the best team. If you're a sports guy, that was the thing that the New England Patriots were really good at during the Tom Brady era. The reason that they were always winning Super Bowls, it felt like, was because they tended to create very good teams where even though they didn't have, 10 players that were on, the all-pro team that year, they still managed to do amazingly well because they all worked together as a unit and they all figured out their roles and their places within the team to help make the team the best team it could be. And that's what I really think you have to look for is, how do your pieces fit together? Finding the right piece for your team, not just the best performer.
So good. I can't help but think of Moneyball as you're sharing that.
Yep.
Every time I see Moneyball, all I can think about is hiring. Total nerd.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's very much like exactly right. Like when you look at Moneyball, and if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's a solid movie, and very enjoyable. And if you like Brad Pitt, you get Brad Pitt too. But that having the entire notion is, just, hey, it's not just about getting the best players. It's about getting the guys that will work together the best to help create the greatest team. And the Oakland Athletics figured out how to do it really well during that era because they figured out, no, we can actually get a bunch of low-priced guys. We just get guys that do the right things. When we put them in the correct order, boom, look how good we are. And it's the same thing with any team. So I think there's always a lot of lessons to be learned, whether it's from sports or, from specific industries, whether you look at, McDonald's production line style, setups and things like that, whatever it might be, there's always something to be learned from other industries.
Beautiful. Last time we talked, you mentioned interview feedback forms and having a consistent way of recording interview observations and feedback as a protection method. I was wondering if you could speak to that and help people understand how this protects them legally against risk, but also provides incredible functional utility to the hiring process.
Sure. So I think the key when actually, let me back up just a step. I think where we do occasionally see lawsuits involving actual recruiting and the interviewing process, it's normally because someone feels that they clearly were the best candidate and then did get selected. As I was just saying, sometimes you don't actually want to pick the best candidate for the job or the best candidate for the job, because what you're actually doing is not picking it for that job title. You're picking it for the best job or the best person in that job for the team. And so recording what it is, that the person has indicated to you, why it is you like this person when you're interviewing them, helps put those things down. Because if you get sued a year from now about some interview that you did a year ago, you're not going to specifically remember what it was about that person that you liked or didn't like, what it was that was, the vibe that you didn't enjoy, what answer they gave that you went, oh no, like this is not the right person for us. I have interviewed people several times where they seem like a really good candidate. And then at the end of the interview, there was about 20 minutes of questions that amounted to, so how much money am I going to make and how good are your benefits? I went, okay, so the only questions you had were about the money and the benefits. I know what you're about now. I will not hire someone who's about money and benefits. I want to hire someone who's about learning, growing in their field, getting better at their job because they want to be the best attorney they can be. So when I've got someone who just talks to me about money, I'm done no matter how good a candidate they are. But if you ask me a year from now, hey, Kevin, who was that person that you interviewed who only cared about money? So it's great to have notes from the interview and have a standard process sheet that shows, like, hey, what was it that you liked about this candidate? What didn't you like about this candidate? And kind of why under both. And you can set it up however you want, but generally that's kind of what you want to have. Because then later, if you come back, because there's a lawsuit, you can look at those things and go, look, we really liked this person who we hired because we thought they were going to be a really good fit because they said this and that fits well with these people on our team. They said this, which fits well here with these things. And as long as the things you're looking at are not things where inherently you're now discriminating, like, oh, this is a great person because they fit in well with all the other white people on my team, but instead are based on things that matter to the job, you're going to be okay to write those things down and talk about those things. And more importantly, then you also have down the reasons why you didn't like those people. So if you ever had to testify, you can just go, let me look in my notes. They talked about money for 20 minutes at the end of the interview, and that seemed like the only thing they really cared about. So we decided that we would hire someone who didn't only care about the money, but wanted to be a member of a good and productive team. Thank you. That is it for my testimony today.
Yeah. Basic protection. Fascinating. On the utility side, do you see hires being made, without clear justification? Let's say they don't have a feedback form. They don't have a commonly understood heuristic for making the decision. Do you feel like that contributes to any particular ambiguity in a hire and might increase risk?
Yes. I always think it is important to know what it is you're looking for going into a set of interviews. And I think when people don't know that, it does, especially if you're doing like group interviews. And by that, I mean where you have like 3 people interviewing a single candidate. I hope most people are not doing, interviewing multiple candidates. I find that normally not a good strategy, but maybe that's just me. But when you've got multiple people interviewing someone, I want to make sure that we all know what it is that we as a group are looking for. Because if not, you're going to get very different responses and you're going to end up picking probably a subpar candidate because now you're all looking for something a little different. Maybe it's, the thing that I need the most on the team, even though that's not what the team needs the most. And so I think you've pointed out a good thing here, which is we've got to figure out what it is we're looking for, all kind of get on the same, boat, I guess, in terms of what that metric should be or what metrics we're looking for, and then try and, see who it is that actually meets that call.
Does that give you hives as a lawyer if I'm leading the witness?
No, not at all.
So AI has been a big thing, right? We've got these AI note takers in Zoom meetings. It's nearly ubiquitous now. AI is in recruiting dramatically. It's probably in law dramatically, and it's only going to get more dramatic. So I'm curious of your just thoughts at this point. Obviously, this is going to evolve, but what do you think about AI note takers at interviews, and ideally to help employees and interviewers keep interviews on track, cover what they need to cover? But how do you think about the potential risk and mitigating that risk of employees or interviewers saying stuff that they shouldn't say, which I got to say in construction is a bit of a problem. Like sometimes we've got some veterans who take risks that they shouldn't take.
So I've got 2 kind of competing immediate thoughts on that. And the first one is, number one, if you are doing any sort of recording, make sure you know your state laws on that, because in some states, you can't record somebody without them knowing about it. So make sure you know that, because you might need to tell them at the beginning. Second, I always say, especially in the law, documented or it didn't happen. sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad, because if you document something that you did badly, now that exists and there is a record of it. You're going to have to live with that. By the same token, if you're doing everything right, having a record of it's great, because now, going back to what we were talking about before, I know exactly what questions got asked. I know exactly what answers got given. I have things I can point out about, oh, the reason I didn't like this person who I interviewed was because of this answer, and this answer. And so it can be great in those instances. But I think if you are using those sorts of tools, you want to make sure that you really have trained your folks to, one, only have the folks interviewing that really know what they're doing, and two, that those folks are fairly well trained on the things they have to avoid talking about. And or if some of these things get brought up, how do you deal with them? Like, you might be talking to someone and they just go, hey, I'm very excited about this job, but I cannot work on Sundays because that is a holy day for my religion. I'm just hoping that's not a problem. But if it is, I understand. I have definitely seen interviewers who are just like, I'm not allowed to talk about your religion. Let us move on. And I mean, that's a legally safe answer, but it doesn't mean that, the thing that just got said didn't get said. And it's a very strange response for you to now handle it that way. So then if that person doesn't get hired later, they're thinking back on the interview, they're going to go, there was that moment when I brought up my religion and that person freaked out.
How ironic.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the kind of thing where you got to be careful, right? And so I think it's important to make sure that your folks are well trained so they are aware what situations could pop up. They kind of have, I don't know, role played or whatever they need to do to get used to those situations and dealing with them. So when things do unexpectedly take an interesting turn, they at least know how to kind of gracefully exit from those conversations. And also, what notations do you need to write down? Because now, for example, you might know that somebody has a disability that you need to deal with, but they have told you, oh, no, I'd be able to do this job with an accommodation. Great. That's all I need to know. We're good to go. And so that's just those sorts of things. But I think that's all very trainable. It's just if you are going to be recording things, make sure your people know what they're doing. Otherwise, you're creating bad record for yourself.
So let's wrap up with that. So let's say I've got an interviewing team. How could I work with you and be responsible in managing my risk, training my team to understand their go and no-go areas? And how do I do this in a way that doesn't subject them to PowerPoint hell?
That's an excellent question. One, I guess we should do more podcasts, maybe.
Let's do it.
If that's not going to work, we're not going to do a podcast series on that. Excellent. All right. I think the second thing I'd say is there is a real opportunity to form relationships with attorneys that care about small and mid-sized businesses, large businesses too. But I mean, that's what I like focusing on. Those are the ones who normally need the most help in this, right? And I think there's a real chance to form relationships with some of those people who do care about you, care about your business, want to see you succeed. And they understand these sorts of things that we're talking about, and they can help train your folks. More than that, there are some very good training organizations out there that can help train you on these sorts of things. Some very solid HR consultants out there. So I think what you got to do first is find yourself one of those people who you trust and who you feel knows what they are talking about. And then approach that person and say, look, we need some help in this area. And to be honest, hopefully sometimes they go, I could help you in that area, but that's not the thing that I'm the best at. This other person's amazing at it. Let me get you them. Because those are the people who are referring you out to other people, and they're not going to just try and do it themselves, where they're not doing it because they're just trying to get money out of you. They're trying to help you because they're trying to get you to the right person to do the best job possible. And so those are the kind of people I always look for when I'm looking for legal services, consulting services, whatever it might be, are the people who are willing to say, look, it's in my best interest, but it's in your best interest. When you find one of those people, hold on to them because they are very useful, and they're probably worth their weight in gold because they'll make sure that you always get the help.
It's a good life rule. Kevin, thank you. How can people get a hold of you and level up their game?
If you ever need help, whether it's advice and counseling, or unfortunately you're getting sued for something, or you just want to make sure that you're mitigating risk on either the recruiting level, the while you have employees level, making sure your paperwork's right, whatever it might be, you are more than welcome to give me a call or to send me an email. I'll have TJ make sure that we put that in somewhere wherever this is going to end up so that you can get a hold. And I'd be happy to talk to you.
That's great. Put it right on the screen. It'll be in the description too. Kevin, thank you. This is incredible.
Hey, my pleasure. Good to talk to you as always.
All right. Thanks, folks. If you need help with your recruiting in your construction business and you want a team that only cares about building alignment in their teams, human sensitivity, you can also find a link in the description for an exploratory call with me. And we're looking for servant leaders who are growing great construction firms in the continental U.S. Ciao.